This Israel report is brought to you by the Blue Agency. Your Israel property is in good hands. Owning properties in Israel can be a great investment, but challenging to manage if you're based abroad. The Blue Agency will manage every aspect of your property, finding and vetting tenants, maintaining your property and getting it rental ready, negotiating contracts and collecting rentals, reporting back to you regularly. The Blue Agency has built a reputation for trust and confidentiality over 20 years. The Blue Agency, your Israel property is in good hands. Contact us at www.theblueagency.com.
The Israel Report for the latest news and insights with Anthony Reich.
Anthony Reich, Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. How are you?
Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. I'd like to start with a shout out, if I may, to the Israeli girls under 20 basketball team. They've been playing in the European Championships for the girls under 20 in Klaipėda in Lithuania. And last night, they came up against France in the final of the tournament. A real battling performance by the Israeli girls who managed to get through the Spanish team in the semi-finals to ultimately reach the finals last night. Unfortunately, were beaten by France in the final. To be fair, the French girls were a very, very good team, and the Israeli team were well beaten in the end, even though they gave a great performance. And I think that it's very admirable that our girls can be the silver medalists for the European under-20 girls basketball. I think it's a great achievement. And they came pretty close to being the champions. They were beaten by France in the end, but there was really no shame in their performance, and they really did a brilliant job. So a great achievement and a shout out to them. And then just a story which caught my eye, which I don't know if it's relevant to anything in particular, but I think it has some relevance. And this is the story about the gift that Turkish President Erdogan gave the NATO leaders who gathered in Ankara last week for the NATO summit. And as the summit was wrapping up, the Turkish leader decided to present each of the visiting leaders of NATO countries with a personal gift. It was in a bag, and many of them didn't even know what was in there until they'd opened it up later. But the bag contained a live weapon, a pistol, a Turkish manufactured 357 Magnum pistol, which was in a box with 6 live rounds included in the package. Each pistol apparently was personally engraved with the name of the leader on the weapon. And this was packed up very nicely, along with apparently a signed copy of the English language biography entitled The Politics of Courage, Erdogan and the Rise of Turkey, which apparently was presented to each leader, the biography of the Turkish leader himself, and a personal letter, and of course a fountain pen, which we all know is very important in these gifts. But the point is that the gift of a weapon was really controversial, and many of the leaders were forced to leave that gift behind. They couldn't travel with it. Others had to go through major security headaches and concerns in order to have the weapon decommissioned before they could leave, or presented to security when they arrived. In any event, the value of the weapon was way more than is allowed, than is acceptable within most of those countries anyway. So the leaders were never going to retain those weapons for themselves personally, because according to the laws of the various countries, they're unable to retain personal gifts of the value that is so high as that one. But interestingly, of course, there was something behind this. First of all, I think Erdogan likes to be a little bit out there, and he doesn't necessarily abide by the rules. And I think we need to really take note of that. But of course, the Turkish small arms industry is amongst the most prolific in the world. Apparently, they are second or third on the list of small arms manufacturers around the world. And so this, of course, is a marketing campaign to try to advertise Turkey's great small arms export business that they have to try and promote that amongst world leaders. But I think, as unusual as the gift is, and as much as it's attracted headlines, I think it does send a message about Erdogan and whether he is sensitive to rules and regulations
Yeah,
that other
and
NATO countries
yeah.
abide by, and whether he cares about that at all. And I think there is a lot that can be read into this very, very unusual gift.
And also the fact that he is so out of touch that he thinks it's okay, that it'll just be fine to hand these out, and that nobody will have an issue with it. Anyway, very, very interesting. The US has carried out further extensive attacks against Iranian targets overnight. Right. So what does this mean? Is the battle still focused on the Strait of Hormuz, or has it gone further?
Well, if you look at what Iran is doing, the Iranian part of this particular mini war, I think is what I would call it, because it's now almost into a week-long battle where almost every day there are strikes backwards and forwards. The Iranians are striking two particular targets. First of all, ships that are sailing within the Straits of Hormuz that are not adhering to the shipping lanes that have been dictated by the Iranian regime, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. So, for example, yesterday, it was a Cypriot oil tanker that was attacked by a drone because it wasn't adhering to the lay-down shipping lanes that the Iranians have put down, have dictated, and it was sailing in that Omani route, which is the route that the U.S. Army is attempting to protect and to allow freedom of movement of ships that are not related to Iran. So the Iranians, in the first instance, are really trying to lay down their rules in the Straits of Hormuz, while various tankers are relying upon the protection of the US Army in that area to get them through the Omani shipping route, which of course is the one that is opposed to the Iranians. Now, exactly why the Iranians find it important for ships to go through their routes as opposed to the Omani route, well, I think it's all about who they're allowing through, and that they might have certain preference for countries that are considered to be friends of Iran, and they might well be trying to exclude ships who may be considered to be more closely associated with the US. And therefore, I think the US is trying to send a message of business as usual through the Straits of Hormuz. And if Iran doesn't allow it, then we will protect you and we will allow the ships to go through. But the reality is, and yesterday it was such a joke watching the social media, the Iranians are saying the Straits of Hormuz are closed. Then President Trump tweets saying, also on his
yeah, it's exactly.
on his
I
social
couldn't
media,
follow this. It was bizarre.
it was really bizarre. He's saying, well, the Straits of Hormuz are open for business and the US is protecting. And this is all, of course, being sent out on Truth Social, which is the President Trump's social media site. And it was backwards and forwards, one statement contradicting the other. Nobody really knows whether one statement is true, whether both statements are false. It's all really quite a ridiculous situation. But the fact is that the Iranians are clearly trying to prevent any US involvement in the Straits of Hormuz, and to the extent that the US is protecting oil tankers, the Iranians are willing to fire against that. So that's really generally being the opening salvo on each successive day of this ongoing battle. Then the US responds by firing their missiles against, first of all, trying to intercept drones and cruise missiles that are being launched at oil tankers in the Straits of Hormuz. The US intercepting these cruise missiles, intercepting the drones to try to protect the tankers that are trying to go through the Omani route. And the US also attacking sites within the Straits of Hormuz, Sirik Island, the Bandar Abbas port, and those kind of places, to try somehow to give more freedom of movement to ships through the Straits of Hormuz. However, behind the scenes, It turns out that the US has also attacked one or two other strategic locations around Iran, including some sort of a rail link in the north of Iran, which apparently was shipping arms from Russia towards Iran, and potentially from Turkey as well towards Iran. And so the US attacked that rail link. We understand as well that there have been attacks directed towards some of the nuclear sites in Iran, Bushehr nuclear reactor site, and others, which is not quite as publicly known. Then Iran has responded to that by firing missiles towards US bases elsewhere in the Gulf. So Jordan and Kuwait and Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, these countries have all come under Iranian attack over the last few days, because of the fact that they've got US bases there, and theoretically the object of these attacks really are the US bases in these countries. But the reality is that this is attack against a sovereign nation, a sovereign neighbor of Iran. And so all of this is really, in my view, escalating with each successive day, even though almost every day looks like the other day. But the reality is that with each day that goes by and these attacks that continue to take place, it just escalates on and on and on. So my view is that this is an escalation, even though a lot of it is really focused on the Straits of Hormuz, but this is certainly an escalation. And I'm not really quite sure where it goes. I mean, Israel for now is seeming quite relaxed. There are no particular instructions given by the Home Front Command, nothing to change anybody's behavior. The IDF is reported to be on a very extensive alert, broader than the case was before. The other little snippet that gets added into this whole mix is the fact that President Trump decided that he should be, it should be made publicly known that he is Iran's #1 target. And there has been the story going around in the press about Israel having warned President Trump that he was the subject of a particular plan to assassinate him. We understand that that plan involved assassinating President Trump in Turkey during last week's NATO summit, something that clearly was not ultimately did not take place and was not exercised. But the US ambassador, Mike Huckabee, has come out saying it is true that Israeli intelligence warned President Trump of this plan, that they had to assassinate him. The Israelis have also made public that they were involved in warning President Trump. And of course, there's a lot of speculation about why Israel would have it in its interests to make this public, whether the attempted publicity was to potentially try to rile the US up a little bit more, to create more of a war so that Israel might be able to get involved and ultimately carry out one of its plans, or some of its plans, extensive plans that it has to attack Iran and to try to create more trouble. I don't know what what listeners might think about the possibility of Israel trying to stir the pot a little bit to try to create more of a conflict. But it turns out that that is possibly true, that there was a plan to assassinate President Trump in Turkey last week, something that was clearly ultimately foiled in the process. And it is true that Israeli intelligence was involved in advising the president of this plan.
Senator Lindsey Graham, who was a tremendous friend to Jews around the world, to Israel, has died unexpectedly over the weekend. Is his death considered suspicious?
Most definitely. I just read this morning, though, that the medical report that's come out of the US suggests that he had some heart disease and that his death is connected to that. However, one cannot ignore that only last week the Iranians were waving Senator Lindsey Graham's picture around with a huge X on his forehead as being one of the targeted people. And since he died on Saturday night, the Iranians have touted around their list of targets that they would like to get rid of, very much like what Israel has done with Hamas or with Hezbollah, shown the list of the leadership and those people on that structure chart who are have currently been taken care of and who are no longer around, and those who potentially are still on the list and who might wish to be showering with helmets on. But Lindsey Graham was on that list of targets for sure that Iran that Iran was targeting. And of course, with the background to this plan to assassinate President Trump in Turkey last week, one has to wonder whether potentially Senator Lindsey Graham might not have been a victim of some Iranian attack, which may well have, I don't know, somehow escalated his already existing coronary disease that he suffered. It's very, very difficult to know. But there is no doubt that he was on their list of targets, that he has been a great spokesperson for the Trump administration. When President Trump didn't want to make official statements, Lindsey Graham was always the one making public statements in the name, almost in the name of the Trump administration. Very supportive of Israel, a great friend of Israel's, and he certainly will be missed in the U.S. political thrust and cut atmosphere and the work that he's done on the international arena. And one can't ignore the work that he's done to try to bring Saudi Arabia to a peace agreement with Israel. That's one of his great projects and one of the areas that he's had great success. Unfortunately, he didn't live to ultimately see it come to fruition. But I think he's pretty much brought this to the edge as far as he can take it. And I have little doubt that his work will ultimately be rewarded. So he will be greatly missed, and we're very sad to see his death. And we will be watching to see if there's any news about exactly what happened and whether we need to be concerned about the way in which he died.
That is where we leave it. Anthony Reich, thank you as always. It is 8:01. We can catch Anthony tomorrow morning with the Israel Report at 7:45.
That Israel Report was brought to you by the Blue Agency. Your Israel property is in good hands. Owning properties in Israel can be a great investment, but challenging to manage if you're based abroad. The Blue Agency will manage every aspect of your property, finding and vetting tenants, maintaining your property and getting it rental ready, negotiating contracts and collecting rentals, reporting back to you regularly. The Blue Agency has built a reputation for trust and confidentiality over 20 years. The Blue Agency, your Israel property is in good hands. Contact us at www.theblueagency.com.
This is 101.9 High FM News.